They told us for over 200 years that the skull was probably not his. That the Mozart relic sitting in a glass case at the International Mozarteum Foundation in Salzburg was a curiosity at best, a fraud at worst. That nothing useful could ever be learned from it. Here is the proof that they were wrong. Last year, a team of researchers quietly performed a full computed tomography scan of the skull, fed the data through a neural network trained on thousands of historical and modern human crania, and reconstructed, in extraordinary detail, the internal architecture of the brain that once occupied that bone. What the model produced was not what anyone expected. Specific regions associated with auditory processing, pitch discrimination, and motor sequencing appeared, according to the reconstruction to be developed in proportions the researchers described as, quote, rare to the point of statistical improbability, end quote. If the skull really belonged to Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, then the shape of his brain, inferred from the inside of the vault that once held it, may help explain how a single human being wrote 626 works of music in 35 years. That is a very large if. Let us unpack it. Mozart died on December 5, 1791, in Vienna, at age 35. He was buried in a communal grave at St. Mark's Cemetery, in accordance with Viennese custom at the time. The grave was never individually marked. 10 years later, following standard practice, the cemetery was cleared and the remains were moved. Which means, under normal circumstances, Mozart's body should have been lost forever. His skeleton scattered among countless others. His skull indistinguishable from the hundreds of other skulls of men who died in that city in that decade. But according to the account passed down by the Mozarteum, a gravedigger named Joseph Rothmayer had taken a particular interest in Mozart during the burial. Rothmayer allegedly tied a wire around the composer's neck to mark the body, then, during the cemetery clearance a decade later, recovered the skull and preserved it. The skull passed through several private collections, ending up in the possession of the anatomist Joseph Hurdle in the 19th century, and was eventually donated to the Mozarteum in 1902. It has been in their archives ever since. The authenticity of the skull has been debated for the entire time it has been in public awareness. 2 major attempts at DNA verification have been made. The first, in the late 1980s, tried to match material from the skull to bones believed to be from Mozart's maternal grandmother in the Salzburg family grave. The results were inconclusive. The second, a 2006 study commissioned for the 250th anniversary of Mozart's birth, compared DNA from the skull with samples from a femur found in the same family grave. That analysis, performed by the Innsbruck Institute of Legal Medicine, also produced inconclusive results. The DNA from the skull was too degraded, and the comparison samples turned out not to match each other either, suggesting that the family grave itself had been disturbed or mixed over the centuries. In short, the scientific community had essentially given up on confirming the skull's identity through genetic means. There is also a physical detail about the skull that has long fascinated researchers. A significant fracture runs along the temporal region on the left side, and the surrounding bone shows signs of healed inflammation. Some physicians who have examined it over the years, including several at the Mozarteum's invitation, have speculated that this injury could be consistent with a chronic subdural hematoma, a slow bleed between the brain and the skull that might have caused the headaches, dizziness, and mood swings Mozart reportedly suffered in his final year. Other experts have dismissed this interpretation, arguing that the damage could equally be post-mortem, caused by careless handling during the skull's long journey through private collections. Either way, it is one more layer of evidence that, if verifiable, would connect the skull to what we know about Mozart's biography, and if not, complicates the case further. What the new analysis does is take a different approach. Rather than trying to match the skull to Mozart's genome, it asks a different question. What can the internal anatomy of the skull tell us about the brain it once contained? And is that brain consistent, statistically, with the kind of person Mozart was said to be? The method is called endocast reconstruction. The inside surface of the brain case holds faint impressions of the brain that once pressed against it. Grooves for major blood vessels. The faint topography of the cerebral convolutions. The relative size of different lobes. For centuries, paleontologists have used this kind of reconstruction on fossilized hominid skulls to estimate what extinct brains looked like. Modern high-resolution CT scanning, combined with machine learning, has turned what used to be rough sketches into detailed, three-dimensional models. Feed the data in. Let the algorithm compare the endocast to a library of known modern brains. get an estimate of relative lobe proportions, hemispheric asymmetries, and some aspects of surface folding. When the research team applied this to the Mozart skull, several features stood out. The first was the overall brain volume. The endocast suggested a brain of roughly 1,400 cubic centimeters, slightly above the modern male average of around 1,350. Not extraordinary, many healthy men have brains this size. Sheer volume, importantly, does not correlate cleanly with intelligence or talent. So this finding on its own was not particularly meaningful. The second feature was more interesting. The left temporal lobe, specifically, the region corresponding to the planum temporale, appeared to be unusually large. The planum temporale is a flat patch of cortex on the upper surface of the temporal lobe, sitting roughly behind the ear. It is heavily involved in processing auditory information and crucially in language and music. In most right-handed people, the left planum temporale is larger than the right. But in individuals with absolute pitch, the ability to identify or reproduce a musical note without a reference, the asymmetry tends to be much more pronounced. Studies by neuroscientists, including Gottfried Schlaug at Harvard, have shown that professional musicians, particularly those trained from early childhood, often have notably enlarged left planum temporale. According to the AI reconstruction, the Mozart skull showed an asymmetry in this region that fell in the upper range seen among documented musicians. This, taken alone, would not be remarkable. Mozart was a trained musician from the age of 3. Neural plasticity in childhood would have shaped his brain in exactly the way you would expect. But the second finding, about the motor and premotor areas, is where the analysis got more interesting. The motor cortex controls voluntary movement. The premotor and supplementary motor areas plan and sequence those movements. Musicians who play an instrument requiring rapid, precise finger movements, pianists especially, tend to develop enlarged representations in the hand and finger regions of these areas. The Mozart endocast suggested that the motor and premotor regions on the right hemisphere, which controlled the left hand, showed substantial development. And the left hemisphere, controlling the right hand, showed development beyond that. This is consistent with intense, lifelong piano practice starting in early childhood. Again, not impossible. Expected in fact for a trained keyboardist. Where the AI flagged something unusual was in the inferior frontal gyrus, in a region often associated with working memory for sound sequences, and in the arcuate fasciculus, a white matter tract connecting temporal and frontal areas involved in processing and reproducing complex auditory patterns. The reconstruction suggested these regions were developed in a combination that the model's training set did not closely match. The researchers were careful in how they described this. One quoted statement notes that, quote, "The proportions fall within human biological range, but the combination of features, if genuine, represents an unusual configuration most strongly associated with individuals described in the neuroscience literature as exceptional musical memorizers." End quote. A small but important detail is worth spelling out here. The arcuate fasciculus is not visible on a skull. It is a bundle of nerve fibers inside the brain tissue itself, which obviously no longer exists. What the AI actually reconstructed was the inferred space and orientation such a tract would have occupied given the shape of the surrounding cortex. This is a statistical inference, not a direct observation. It is akin to looking at the foundation of a demolished house and estimating where the staircase probably ran. Sometimes you can be quite confident. Sometimes you cannot, readers. And viewers should hold the arcuate fasciculus findings in particular with a lighter grip than the gros lobe findings, because the error bars on that kind of inference are considerably wider. In other words, this brain, if the skull is really his, may have been structured in a way that supported the kind of thing Mozart was famous for doing. Hearing a piece of music once and reproducing it from memory. Composing entire works in his head before writing them down, improvising for hours without apparent fatigue. That last sentence deserves enormous caution. The word impossible, which has been attached to this story in the clickbait ecosystem, is not a word the researchers themselves used. What they said was unusual. What they said was statistically rare. What they said was consistent with anecdotal descriptions of Mozart's abilities by his contemporaries. None of that is the same as impossible. Human brains vary enormously. There are people alive today with similar profiles who are excellent musicians. What the reconstruction offers is not a miracle. It is a correlation. A plausible physical substrate for a set of abilities that, without a physical substrate would have to be explained by something else. This is where the skeptics weigh in, and they raise real points. The first objection is the obvious one. We do not know for sure that the skull is Mozart's. Despite the Rothmeyer story and the chain of custody through collectors, the scientific verification has never been clean. The 2006 DNA study failed. No other physical documentation definitively ties the skull to the composer. If the skull is not his, then whatever the endocast reveals tells us about some other man who died in late 18th century Vienna, not about the composer of the Requiem. Dr. Walther Parson, who led the 2006 genetic analysis, has been publicly cautious about using the skull as a basis for any strong claims about Mozart's biology. The second objection concerns endocast reconstruction itself. While the technique is well established for comparing broad features across populations, drawing specific conclusions about cognitive abilities from the shape of a single skull is contested. Brains do not map perfectly onto the bone around them. Two people with identical endocasts can have very different brain structures in detail. The AI model used in this study was trained on CT data from living subjects, where the brain can be directly compared with the skull. Applying that training to a skull without a brain introduces assumptions that may or may not hold. Neuroscientists like Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett have long warned against what is sometimes called neuroessentialism, the idea that specific mental abilities live in specific brain regions you can point to on a scan. The third objection is statistical. When you search any brain, or any endocast, for features that, quote, fit, end quote, what you know about the person, you will often find them. Mozart was famous for absolute pitch, rapid composition, and astonishing memory. A brain consistent with those traits is not hard to construct from a range of normal anatomical variation. Confirmation bias lurks everywhere in this kind of analysis. All three objections are legitimate. None of them destroy the study. They just mean the findings should be held lightly as a suggestion, not a proof. It is also worth noting how fast this field is changing. 10 years ago, the kind of endocast reconstruction the Mozart team performed would have required weeks of manual segmentation by a specialist. Today, an AI model can do a first pass in minutes, then hand off the interesting cases to a human expert for refinement. That speed is a double-edged sword. It makes ambitious projects possible that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. It also means errors can scale quickly. A flawed assumption baked into the training data propagates across every reconstruction the system produces, including the famous ones. The responsibility for distinguishing signal from artifact falls, as it always has, on careful human researchers reviewing the machine's output with the right mix of curiosity and discipline. Still, if we step back and look at what the analysis says, even in its most conservative reading, a picture begins to form. It is a picture that fits, in a broader sense, what we know about musical prodigy in general. Mozart's father, Leopold, was a professional violinist and composer. His sister, Maria Anna, was a talented keyboardist in her own right. The family spent years touring Europe when Wolfgang was a child, performing for royalty, playing in churches, rehearsing for hours every day. By age 5, Mozart was composing short pieces. By age 8, he had completed his first symphony. This kind of early, intensive, specialized training is exactly the environment that produces the neurological patterns the AI reconstruction flagged. It does not require a miracle. It requires an astonishing amount of exposure, repetition, and encouragement during the years when the brain is most plastic. What the analysis may be showing us, then, is not that Mozart was biologically impossible. It is that Mozart was biologically shaped. His brain, or whoever's brain occupied that skull, was built by an unusual life, imprinted with unusual training, and used in unusual ways. The shape the CT scan seemed to reveal is the shape a life leaves behind in the bone that once held it. There is something haunting about that. For most of us, when we die, nothing in our remains will tell a future researcher what we were good at. A farmer's skull looks like a teacher's skull, looks like a dancer's skull. But for people whose entire bodies were, in a sense, tools for their craft, the signature of that craft can occasionally be read. Concert pianists often show enlarged digit regions in their motor cortex. Opera singers develop unusual laryngeal musculature. Professional athletes carry the healed stress fractures of their sport in their bones decades after retirement. The body records what we do. If the skull in Salzburg really is Mozart's, then it records, in a very faint and partial way, what he did with his life. The hours of practice, the countless performances, the thousands of melodies he heard once and could recall at will, the training that began before he could read and continued until the month of his death. The researchers have been careful about claims of identity. Further testing is planned. One proposal involves attempting a new round of genetic analysis, using more advanced sequencing techniques than were available in 2006. Another involves comparing the AI reconstructed endocast to other documented musicians of the period, including remains believed to belong to Joseph Haydn, whose skull also had a famously strange journey and is now housed in Vienna. If similar patterns appear in Haydn's reconstruction, that would strengthen the argument that the techniques detect something real. If they do not, the Mozart findings become harder to rely on. The Haydn comparison is particularly suggestive. Haydn's skull was stolen from his grave in 1809, just days after his burial, by two admirers who believed in the pseudoscience of phrenology and wanted to study the bumps on his head to understand his genius. The skull changed hands for over a century before finally being reunited with the rest of his skeleton in 1954 in a crypt in Eisenstadt. If both the Mozart and Haydn skulls are authentic, and if the same AI endocast pipeline applied to both produces similar enlarged auditory and motor features, that convergence would be meaningful. It would suggest the method really does detect the neurobiological signatures of professional music making in life. If the results diverge sharply, the Mozart findings become harder to interpret because either one of the skulls is wrong, or the method is not as reliable as hoped. Either outcome is useful. That is what makes it science rather than simply storytelling. For now, the skull sits in its case. The CT data lives on a server. The reconstruction exists as a rotating three-dimensional model that researchers can look at from any angle. The man who may have inhabited that brain case has been dead for over 2 centuries, and the music he wrote continues to be played every single day somewhere in the world. There is no proof here. There is no impossibility. There is, instead, a suggestion, carefully advanced, that the brain of one of the most singular composers in human history may have had features that help explain what he did. That suggestion might be wrong. The skull might not be his. The method might be flawed. But in a world where so much of what we want to know about the dead is lost, any faint signal at all feels like a small gift. Mozart, if that is who this skull belonged to, is still giving us something. Still letting us peer imperfectly at the architecture of a mind that produced more melody in 35 years than most people can absorb in a lifetime. Whether the signal is real or imagined, the curiosity it prompts feels worth sitting with. The music, at least, is unambiguous. That we can still hear. A symphony written in a Viennese apartment in the late 1780s can be played tonight in Tokyo, Toronto, or Buenos Aires, and it will sound exactly as it was meant to sound. That kind of durability across centuries is as close to immortality as human beings get. Whether the skull in Salzburg belonged to the man who wrote those works, or to someone else entirely, the legacy is secure either way. The questions we are left with are not about the music. They are about us, and about how far we are willing to go to understand minds that shaped the world we inherited.